Hey adapters, welcome back. Today we are talking about the 15th International Conference on Community-based Adaptation to Climate Change, or CBA15. The CBA brings together climate adaptation practitioners from around the world to discuss locally driven solutions to a global crisis. We've invited 3 participants who attended CBA15 to reflect on the experience, the messages emerging from the discussions, and what should happen next. Joining me is Susan Nanddudu, a development practitioner with a keen interest in climate change adaptation, climate finance, gender, and recently green cities. Also joining the discussion is Dr. Aditya Bahadur, a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development in the United Kingdom. And finally, Obed Koringo, who's a climate governance expert working with CARE International as a civil society advocacy coordinator. Everybody, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right, folks, we're going to talk about CBA 15, and you guys are experts in this, and it's this really interesting conference, and I actually had a chance to go to that, and we'll get into that later, but I thought maybe we could learn a little bit more about you. I did a little brief introduction, but let's just kind of go around. Aditya, could you give a little bit more background of where you work and sort of your area of expertise?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. Pleasure to be on the show this evening. Greetings from Delhi. I'm a principal researcher at the IIED, and I work in the urban team. And a lot of my work is at the intersection of urban development and climate and disaster risk. So my days are spent figuring out how to make sure that cities can develop in a way that climate change and disasters don't affect them. I've also recently written a book on the subject, cheap plug alert, which I hope to talk about more as we carry on.
Okay, Susan, how about you? Let's get a little bit more background.
Yes, thank you, Doug, for having me. My name is Susan Nanddudu. I am from Uganda. I work with a non-government organization in Uganda called African Center for Trade and Development. We are very interested in climate finance and sustainable development in general, and many times we are hosting multi-stakeholder conversations around the different topics, and the CBA is a great space to come and learn and pick and share from the lessons in the country and around the world. So happy to be here, and thanks for having us.
Oh, it's a delight. And Obed, how about you? Let's get a little bit more background.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Obed Koringo, and I work with CARE International as a civil society advocacy coordinator. My role basically involves coordinating Southern civil society advocacy work on climate change adaptation and adaptation finance under the umbrella of Southern Voices on Adaptation. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, guys, I want us to kind of really enjoy this conversation. If you guys have questions for each other and all that, we're going to do that. And so, but let's ground people watching this a little bit more in CBA. It has a rich history. And Susan, what is the CBA though? What's it all about?
So this is a great space for practitioners in community-based adaptation. It started over 15 years ago. In fact, when it started, it used to happen once every 2 years. But over the years, it became an annual event, attracting researchers, NGO representatives, government representatives. And at the beginning, we used to try to deconstruct what adaptation is, what is community-based adaptation. And over the years, we have built that into practice, the community of practice, what is going on around the world, what examples can we learn from to inform policy, and the policy spaces are all at all levels, from the national, regional to the global level. And indeed, we pick key messages that we even take to spaces like the Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC.
So Aditya,
could I ask Susan a quick question, a follow-up question, Doug? Susan, you're a CBA veteran. You've been for 8. I've only been for 4. How have the conferences changed through the 8 that you've attended?
Good question.
So my first was in Tanzania, and back then it was Over almost a full week. So you start with 2 good days of a field visit where you interact with community people, appreciate the challenges associated with climate change and some of the impacts, some of the innovations that the communities are engaged in. And that would feed into the conference to have a conversation on, are those solutions working? What else can be done? What is happening in other communities that can be brought on board in such communities, etc. And they were in person, bringing countries from all over the world. What we didn't have then was South America would hardly be represented. But the last 2 years, thanks to COVID-19, we have had a shift to virtual conferences. And so CBA14, CBA15 have been virtual. And because of that, we have had an opportunity to bring on board the Americas. South America was well represented, and it's a great space here.
Well, so if we could go around the room here, and I think 4 and 8. Susan's got everyone beat here. But so Susan just mentioned that it went virtual, and I think I want all of you to weigh in on this. How did that go? I mean, there's a huge difference being there in person, but everyone went virtual this past year. So what did you think of it, the virtual nature of the conference?
Thank you so much. That's a very good question. I think Susan is a veteran, yes, and I'm not like her, but this was actually my 5th CBA conference. And the first 3 CBAs that I've attended have been physical, save for this previously 2, CBA14 and CBA15, which have been held virtually. But just as the physical conferences, actually CBA15 has not been any different in terms of bringing together practitioners, grassroots representatives, policymakers, researchers, and government planners to be able to share experiences, learn on how to improve and scale adaptation solutions at work. In fact, through the virtual CBA, my experience was that we have been able to even to interact more and share experiences with a wider audience who will not have otherwise been able to travel and attend physical conferences. Of course, there's the monotony and fatigue that comes with virtual events, but CBA sessions were really designed to be participatory and used other interesting features such as cartoon, videos, and illustration to make them interesting. So I can assure you that I did not get bored or sleep during these sessions. Thank you.
And Aditya, following up on that, just tell me about your experience with the virtual conference, but you've been to both too. And what I found with some of these virtual conferences, you have a bounty of riches. There's so many presentations, and sometimes when you go in person, there might be just 1 or 2 themes, and you try to get a lot of people to attend all the presentations. Here you have so many choices. Was that almost an issue that you're like, all these different tracks because we're doing it virtual? Did that come up?
Yeah, I think, Doug, that's a great question. I think there are opportunities and challenges with the format going virtual. And I've had the privilege of going for an in-person CBA and then attending 2 that were online. So I think the difference is, I think the quality of the formal sessions themselves is better in a virtual format. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that, because people can choose quite carefully which session they want to go for instead of wading into sessions, which is what happens in a physical space. Your colleagues are going somewhere, so you tag along with them. Whereas here, you have a chance to reflect on what are the sessions you want to choose and go for those. I also feel that the conversation is richer because sometimes in physical sessions, especially in the afternoon post-lunch sessions, energy kind of lags and people end up looking at the emails and checking Facebook while people are presenting. Whereas here, people who've chosen to be in the session end up, focusing quite a lot. And as Obed rightly said, CBA ensures that the participants stay engaged as opposed to there being someone lecturing at them from the stage. They really make sure that every session has an engagement and a participatory element that keeps people awake. So that's the positive. On the negative side, I feel what one misses in these online conferences is the stuff that happens outside the session that is also equally important. The conversations that you have with colleagues from around the world who you don't meet, often the institutional issues that you can kind of talk about and resolve in confidential conversations on the margins, new project ideas that blossom over a beer at the end of the day in a conference. that kind of soft but vitally important stuff gets lost in an online format.
I think that's an
Just
important point.
to add,
Yeah, Obed, go on. Yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
Just to add, there are also some challenges with that I think people faced that come with the technology and internet coverage, which also comes with these virtual events, and which also stood out in the CBA15, and also issues with time zones. Also was also another challenge that I think is worth mentioning and may affect sometimes participation.
And Susan, I want you to you described a little bit, and I'm very encouraged you'd mentioned South America, because when I went to the one in Uganda a few years ago in person, it was noticeable, South America didn't have a presence there, and there people were trying to, how can we change this? And you're saying the virtual allowed that to happen. But give people a sense of really who's attending this? What sort of organizations? I mean, there's donors, but there's people as nonprofit organizations. Give it kind of like the broader view of who's actually attending these things.
So generally community of practice, and to break that down, we have had community members, representatives, and this one in particular even brought Indigenous peoples, which was great. And one of the sessions I enjoyed the most was having Indigenous people speak to the conference. You have researchers from universities in the global north and the global south. You have representatives from NGOs, from government, from private sector. And I'll say a little more about private sector. Over the years, it's been really difficult to bring the private sector into this space because, they don't have that time to spend for all those, the 3 days plus in a conference in person. But because of the virtual opportunity we have had and attracted more for CBA14 and CBA15, and we have so much insights cutting across from all the categories. But I must also add that we have donors in the space, so it's a free space where we challenge each other, we ask hard questions, and we also listen.
And Obed and Aditya, I want you to weigh in on that. Maybe I'll start with you, Obed, but does anyone sort of different than you typically sort of interact with? And I know you can have sort of side conversations virtually, like any sort of participants that really stood out to you that were quite different than what you're used to?
Yeah, during the CBA15, we had opportunities to interact, such as virtual roundtables, and using these forums, we were able to interact with different kinds of participants and actors who were actually not able to meet if it was a physical sort of event. But more specifically, my role or my work mostly involves civil society advocacy work and influencing. And I used this opportunity to be able to bring CSOs together and be able to discuss issues of concern that involve policy influencing and responsive policy, as well as coming up with key messages to be able to influence policymakers, even as we head towards COP26. Over to you.
And Aditya, did you have like some interesting interactions?
Yeah, I mean, I work at a kind of international policy research institute, and one attends a conference on the issues that we work on every other week. But to me, CBA is fully special for a couple of reasons. One is that you actually meet people who are on the coalface of work to deal with the impacts of climate change. This could be, as Susan rightly said, Indigenous people themselves who are facing the impacts that we all study and talk about. It could also be representatives of communities on the ground, as opposed to meeting just the usual bunch of experts and researchers and academics and senior policymakers from international organizations that you meet at most conversations. Here you can have really exciting conversations that push your own knowledge, that challenge your own notions, because there are people who are actually experiencing the things that one is talking about and researching. I think that's one. The second is, I feel the CBA does a particularly good job of ensuring that there's a wide breadth of people who come and speak. Just at this CBA, we had a minister from the UK government, a senior minister, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, and we had vulnerable communities on the ground. And I think this kind of breadth of audience and speakers is quite unusual for a conference on climate change. I'm not sure if Susan or Obed agree with me.
Yes, I agree with you, Aditya, and especially the fact that it provides an opportunity to bring on board local communities who are actually reeling from the impacts of climate change to be able to give their stories in the best way they know. So I think that was also one of the key areas that I think this virtual CBA really provided an opportunity. Because many times they don't really have a chance to be able to travel long distances to attend physical meetings, but a virtual one will really give them that opportunity.
Susan, did you
I'd
have
like to add?
Yeah, please.
Oh yes, I'd like to add. I agree with you, Aditya, entirely. And if having an opportunity like that, then the conversation is quite interesting. One of the key messages out of this is that we need to create, out of the conference, was to create more opportunities for partnerships across researchers, across Indigenous groups, so many categories. And there was a challenging of the power dynamics. So if you have Indigenous communities represented and you have donors, can we have a space where it is free to talk, to bring ideas on the table, to bring money on the table from a partnership point of view, as opposed to I have the money, therefore what I say matters. So such a space is unique and interesting. And I wanted to add that the youth as a category was also strong in this conference, and their voice came out quite strongly with a core message that they want to be on the table of decision-making around climate change and around the world. Yeah, over.
Well, I was going to ask that about what kind of presence did youth, because in the last 3 or 4 years, youth climate activists have really just sort of exploded. They've become playing a big role. How did that actually manifest itself in this conference? And I'll just kind of throw it out there. Were they specific speakers, or was it just topics that other people, wanted to discuss in side conversations? Does anybody want to take a shot at that?
Yes. So we had actually a youth track, organized and designed by the youth. They brought youth speakers, and in CBA15, if I can backtrack a little bit, there was also a dedicated session for the youth. One of the key messages was that we want space and we want it paid for. Don't call us as volunteers. So as a CBA community, that's now a guaranteed space. The youth have to be there, and we are listening and paying more attention to how do we engage the youth more? How do we help them take the leadership role? How can we build their capacities? And it's a space for learning, and we are learning by doing. Anybody wants to add, perhaps?
Yeah, just to add that, of course, one of the key messages that came out of the youth is the fact that they need to be really meaningfully involved and equitably, meaningfully and equitably involved in high decision-making spaces, rather than tokenistic additions or excluded from the spaces where the real change really and big decisions are made. So the issues of funding and supporting youth platforms really came out clearly or strongly, and of course the right backing and building the right skills for the youth to be able to participate and engage. Thank you.
Well, I think that's an important point, the idea of tokenism in what they're doing, and they need to be given pathways, and like you said, funding and such, and donors. It's one thing to say we need to get the youth involved, but like, here are specific projects, here are specific things that we can do, or here's some examples. Did that come out at the conference? I'm just kind of throwing it out to anybody. Did you have any sort of insight to that, or?
To be honest, I think Susan and Obed are more plugged into the youth track
Okay.
than I am.
Well, Susan, any sort of specific, like even after the fact of the conference that, okay, well, we know here's some actual things for these youth activists to plug into?
Well, I can pick from Dr. Haksalim during the closing ceremony. He did suggest that the decision-making spaces, rather than just invite speakers, climate activists or whatever, young people to speak, they have to create a space for young people on that leadership team. So he had an example of a space that that is happening, and that should be a lesson for all the others. Create room for young people on the decision-making tables.
And I think just to add to that, I myself was involved in a session where they were laying out the organizations, a few organizations came together to lay out a vision for an international alliance for everyone doing research on adaptation called the Adaptation Research Alliance. And they were inviting constituencies from across the world, including youth organizations, to come and infuse this alliance with ideas and priorities that are important to young people. And I think that was just one example of a number of sessions which provided tangible entry points for young people to join up, sign up, and support a process that could really have an impact on the ground.
And Obed, I want to talk a bit about local Indigenous knowledge and the role it'll play in community adaptation. That was obviously talked about quite a bit at CBA, but what really does that mean? Can you give people a little bit more background? What does it mean bringing in local Indigenous knowledge into that process?
Yeah, this really came out very strongly in the conversations, and of course, there's really need to understand that communities already have their lived and lived experiences, and they already have knowledge that they're already using at the ground, at the grassroots level, to be able to adapt and address the challenges that they are facing, especially when it comes to climate change. And there is really need to be able to tap into this knowledge. And it was really evident that local Indigenous knowledge really has an important role to play in the community, in enhancing the resilience of communities. However, there remain significant barriers to the inclusion of the knowledge, especially in the local decision-making forums. Barriers such as the institutional, which are institutional, for instance, decision-making forums remain really one of the key issues that came up is that decision-making forums remain, for instance, highly colonial in structure and function, and can be resistant to effectively integrating local Indigenous knowledge. So therefore, they really need to bring solutions which really involve devolving power from the national level governments to more localized governance institutions, and putting in place programs and tools that can bridge the linguistic and cultural divides and enable local government to integrate Indigenous knowledge that is held by communities into government planning. Because it was really, really important to note that communities already have that knowledge within them, and we do not really need to bombard them with foreign or knowledge that doesn't really work for them, but recognizing that they already are doing something about the knowledge that they have, and supporting them and giving them funding and sort of ensuring that the knowledge that they have is used in a meaningful manner to be able to enhance resilience.
Great. Well, I want to keep on that theme. If other people have something to say, is that I've heard this a lot. Local Indigenous knowledge needs to play a role in community-based adaptation. Did you hear it at the conference? What are some countries or some local regions that are really doing it well, as opposed to we need to do it? Who's really doing it well? Do you guys know of any examples that you'd like to share?
Yeah. Oh,
Susan, go
Aditya?
ahead. Please.
Okay. Thanks. I just want to start by saying that I attended this session, and this lady from an Indigenous community started by inviting us to remember that we are connected to planet Earth, and the water resources, the food that we eat, all of this comes from nature. And sometimes we forget that with our busy lives and city lives. But the Indigenous peoples are so connected and close to these natural resources. And unfortunately, the planning has kept them outside. The planning for investments or even ideas. And we also learned that, because of the way of life that we lead, we are losing the indigenous knowledge. In countries like ours, the indigenous knowledge, so to speak, is normally transferred by word of mouth, by your mother, your grandmother, the family unit, and that is fading away slowly but surely. And we have to learn to capture it, because as we learned from the conference, a lot of knowledge embedded there has helped communities adapt or be resilient in the face of impacts of climate change for many years. But because science has overtaken and technologies have overtaken the way we do things, we many times ignore. And so we had really great examples shared. For instance, there is a Pawanka Fund, which is a dedicated fund that supports indigenous peoples and their initiatives, because they found a gap that these indigenous peoples are not supported by the mainstream funding. And so they are supporting communities in Chile, in parts of Africa, and there were examples of how to bring back simple things such as medicinal plants. And I don't know about you, but here in Uganda, we have had so many experiences of people using herbal or medicinal products to just help them out of the challenges of COVID. And so really getting back to listen and know what was working, what do we need to support to continue working, what isn't working and can be supported by new technologies, among other things, and how do we ensure that the story continues to be told now and into future generations.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, one of the driving narratives of this year's conference was locally led adaptation, which is a new movement that was spearheaded by a few organizations under the aegis of the Global Commission on Adaptation that the Dutch government had initiated. And locally led adaptation at its core is about putting vulnerable communities in the driving seat when it comes to action on climate adaptation, as opposed to business as usual, where communities are invited to participate in spaces and influence incremental decisions. Locally led adaptation argues that communities should have the decisive voice in such processes. And that essentially means that local knowledge and indigenous knowledge has center stage when it comes to decision making. Now, having said that, a key part of locally led adaptation is ensuring that local and indigenous knowledge is melded with top-down scientific information so that we can arrive at the best possible data set with which to make decisions. We are categorically saying that only the knowledge of external experts is not enough. And we're also saying that in many contexts, just indigenous knowledge may not be enough to deal with the uncertain impacts of climate change. We need to make sure that expert knowledge and indigenous knowledge are coming together to make this happen. And Doug, as to your question as to countries that recognize this, that yes, there are a number of countries that are formally enshrining the importance of indigenous and local knowledge in official policy. For instance, Brazil's National Adaptation Plan categorically notes that indigenous knowledge and local knowledge should be used in decision-making around climate adaptation.
I want to go, Obed, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add that, just to add to what Susan said, that one of the examples we were given during the, during the CBA15 was the fact that at the community level, grassroots communities, especially women, did not wait for government aid during the first wave of COVID-19, and they actually used their innovative strategies and local and indigenous knowledge and to be able to stand up and use this knowledge and resources to protect themselves. And I think these groups, local groups who are often led by women and young people, They drew on their social networks and deep local and indigenous knowledge and their own resources to address this crisis. And I think this is really worth noting. Thank you.
Okay, that's a nice pivot there. I want to talk a bit about gender, and maybe Susan, we'll start with you. Is just when you think about adaptation, you actually have to tailor responses thinking about gender. And a lot of countries, a lot of communities don't really even ponder this. Susan, could you give us a bit more background? What does it mean to tailor adaptation responses to gender?
So, great question there. And so there's a lot of research that suggests that climate change impacts men and women differently. And so in the vulnerable countries in particular, communities, we have found that women are disproportionately affected more than the men. And why is this? Maybe, Doug, where you are, you have more empowered women who make their own decisions, decide, what to eat, where to work, what property to own. So you find that is not exactly true in some of our communities. So I'll give you an example that in Uganda, our economy is largely dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and the women play a very pivotal role in agricultural production. But they are sort of shut out when it comes to marketing. You have more voice of the men, and on the other side, they do not own the resources. They have to depend on their male counterparts, their husbands, their brothers, to access the land, to own the land. So when we are talking about adaptation, which is really dealing with the impacts of climate change, we have to have such a context and know that we need to bring both players on board and not leave some behind. We also know that the decision-making power is largely held by the men. When you go to offices, it's the men. When we are splitting the climate finance, mostly it's the men that have that decision-making power. Where are the women? They are the ones dealing with time constraints of walking lots of distances when there's water stress. They are the ones taking care of the sick when there's a flood. So we would like adaptation planning to bring women strongly on board and provide innovations, listen to them first of all, take on board their ideas and have solutions that support both women and men to build resilience. Yeah.
Just to add, during the conference, one of the key messages or lessons that I learned is that we were challenged really to reflect on how patronizing we have been, for instance, to grassroots women by not including them in this.
I'm sorry, Obed.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I'm just celebrating you for bringing that out, so that you were challenged. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, to reflect on how patronizing we have been to grassroots women by not including them in designing solutions. Yet we treat them as beneficiaries or consumers and not as embedded partners in the process. It's also worth noting that communities are really not homogeneous, as you've rightly put it, and there's really a lot of diversity between men, women, the old and young, and the educated. And in the intervention really need to take time to carry out gender and intersectional analysis to understand this diversity in order to understand local agency and then design interventions accordingly. And this is really also very vital to ensuring that even funds can be able to deliver long-term results. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, I want to share an interview I did with this person who does adaptation planning. She goes to these remote islands, and she was in these remote islands in the Solomon Islands. And so when she does adaptation planning, she got there, and how it was set up is that she'll work only with the men doing adaptation planning. but then they'll bring the women in and only do adaptation planning with the women, like, just so they're comfortable, they're just in the same room together. But then when they identified their solutions, and a lot of it was sea level rise related, everyone would come together and actually do the actions that they needed to do. I thought that was fascinating that she recognized that the women did not want to be with men when they're actually in the planning process, but everyone's going to work together when they actually do the action. So really fascinating. Everyone sort of has a different model. Well, okay, guys, I want to talk a bit about, I'm sure it was probably looming large. COP26 is just right around the corner here. Are any of you attending that in person?
Yes, I'll be attending.
So as will I.
And Susan, certainly weigh in, but that must have just come up frequently because it's actually great timing, the sort of the work that you did, the sort of outcomes that came out of your conference. Adaptation seems to be taken more and more seriously by sort of the bigger international negotiations every year, and that's a very encouraging sign. So what are the outcomes you think that'll come into COP26? Maybe Aditya, we'll start with you. How did that come into play at your conference?
Sure. I think, yes, in one way or the other, almost every session referred to what might happen at COP26. And my colleague, Sam Green, who actually runs the conference, pulled together these messages very effectively in an article that he wrote after CBA15 on what are the key implications of the conference for COP26. And a few really interesting things jump out there. One is through the CBA, there was an acknowledgement that intermediary organizations that I would argue are international think tanks like the ones that I work at, or international NGOs, or other organizations that are largely run by experts, need to shift their focus and make sure that they are facilitating local communities to actually take charge of adaptation processes, as opposed to telling communities what they should be doing. So I think that was one kind of key shift, and that is one thing that is going to get carried over into COP26. The second thing that came up in different ways, and I don't know if Susan and Obed agree with me, is an emphasis on ensuring that we have the right monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems in place. I think there was an acknowledgement that more than just accountability to donors, we need to make sure that we are really learning about what works and then diffusing that knowledge as widely as possible so people can benefit from that. And that research must influence action, and that action should influence research. Some of the other things that came up with regard to that have implications for COP26 is the role of climate finance. I think there was an acknowledgement that far too much climate finance is going to intermediary organizations, not down to the communities that are really on the front lines of the battle against climate impacts. And a range of prescriptions were discussed. For instance, some people argued that these international climate funds could ring fence certain parts of funding to be accessed only by Indigenous people, so that Indigenous peoples groups are not competing with international NGOs for the same part of financing. So I think on intermediaries, on monitoring, evaluation, learning, and climate finance, there were a range of really vital issues that came up.
Yeah, just to add on finance, it's also worth noting that developed countries are not on track. And this is also a study that was done by CARE recently that revealed that developed countries are not on track to deliver the promised $100 billion annually to support climate efforts in developing countries. So we find that despite them being the most responsible for the climate crisis, they have failed to clearly outline how they can provide a scaled up, predictable and reliable financial support to the countries that are most at risk. So ahead of COP26, one of the messages that came up is that developed countries should really develop a clear roadmap and effort sharing agreement outlining each country's fair share of the 100 billion financial pledge. And additionally, grants for adaptation need to be scaled up. And should prioritize approaches that are designed with strong involvement and led by local vulnerable communities. Therefore, a longer-term, predictable, secure funding is really necessary to be able to support locally led adaptation. Another issue that came up is the issue of loss and damage. And as we all know, loss and damage due to climate change impact is really impacting a lot of millions of local communities, especially indigenous people and women and children. And it has not really been a priority agenda in the international conventions. So during the CBA, communities and participants recounted stories on how they have been affected by climate-related disasters, losses and damages. And actually we have seen even recently how floods have ravaged through Europe and China. And we cannot really pretend anymore that climate change isn't here with us. So there is really an urgent need for us, for leaders to develop a clear plan to ensure action on loss and damage is delivered, including making climate finance accessible at the local level. Thank you so much.
And Susan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but this whole notion of like longer term funding through donors, you have donors that come to these meetings and most of the time they're pretty supportive, but were there sort of tangible commitments that, okay, the 2-year grant really isn't that helpful. You do have to think longer. Did they offer any sort of encouragement that this is in the works? How did that unfold?
So this is not the space where they give us commitments. So no, really, we didn't have that, except that, one of them did say it's an opportunity for them to listen and learn. But the messages are now for us to take out at whatever level and communicate to all the donors and the donor communities that the short-termism is not working. Yes, we have had great pilots that have demonstrated good and bad, and we want to scale up those results, but we need longer term. The other thing I just wanted to speak to relates to access. And it came out strongly in the conference that COP26 should really come out and speak to revising access modalities for vulnerable countries to access the funds, because climate finance is really complex and the process is so complex. We'd like that to be eased. And in particular, we're looking for direct access to be supported. And that relates to Aditya's point where he says that the conference did have recommendations that these multilateral setup organizations should be facilitative, empowering of those that are on the ground, so that over time there is change. Over time we should have less of the multilaterals and the international institutions leading with access to climate finance. Yeah.
Okay, guys, I just have a couple more questions before we wrap this up. But Aditya, while I have you, you'd mentioned you've written a book and it's on urbanization and resilience. How did that kind of fit into like what you're doing here at CBA? And you could just give the title of the book; that'd be useful too. But what kind of
I can do one better, Doug. I can do an advertisement for it.
Hold it up. That's great. So you see a lot of overlap with what you did in the book and what happened at CBA.
Sure. The book touches on themes of data, monitoring and evaluation, engaging with vulnerable communities, effective planning and finance. And these are all the themes that CBA touched on. I think in future CBAs, I'd like to make sure that the urban theme comes up more prominently, even though a few years ago, I know there was an urban specific CBA, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the themes resonate, but I think there is still scope for urban areas, which is where most of the world now lives, to get a more prominent space in discussions on climate adaptation, including at CBA.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask sort of as we're wrapping this up. Obed, I want to start with you. It sounds like this was a really positive event, CBA15. I guess, are you planning to attend the future events? And if you had to say, like, what else would you like to see? As Aditya just mentioned that he'd like to see more of this. Where would you like it to go? How would you like it to evolve, and what could they include in future conferences?
Yeah, I think so far I'm happy with how the CBA has evolved, and there has been, of course, much more prominence with time on coming up with messages that feed into, for instance, the global conventions like COP26. And within these processes, we have processes like, for instance, the NAP processes, which are led by the least expert group the leg in the NAP process, for instance. So having sometimes parallel events where we are able to feed into these processes, and messages that are able to feed into these processes, I think will really add value. And inviting policymakers and decision makers and being able to listen to the messages themselves in those forums, I think this will really add value even as we work towards influencing the locally-led adaptation narrative.
And Susan, thoughts what could happen next with CBA?
So I'd really love, given the recent events in Europe, to see more people from the developed world come in to listen and learn, because we have a great community that has lots of innovations that can also work, because at least what we have learned from the floods in Europe is that these impacts are going to target all of us, and we each have to be armed with solutions, and this space has the solutions. Come and learn. We often have researchers and donors coming from the global north. I think it's about time to have more, participants just coming to learn from this great space.
Okay, so to close this out, I just want to go around, and if you could just say what's next for you, and if people want to learn more about what you do and get in contact with you, just kind of share that information. But Aditya, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm going to go back to my day job of trying to make sure that cities become more resilient, and I'm on Twitter at Aditya Bahadur. I'd love for any comments or people to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Great. And Obed, how about you?
Yeah, I will continue coordinating civil society advocacy work on climate change. So I encourage all of you to check out the Southern Voices on Adaptation, which is a CSO platform that I'm coordinating in the Global South. And you can also reach me on Twitter at Obed Clement, and I look forward to interacting with you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Susan.
So yes, I'm going to continue with Mawakata Tade. We are a non-governmental organization in Uganda, and we welcome partnerships from around the world to get action on the ground to support the vulnerable, to build resilience. And we'll continue to create spaces for knowledge sharing so that those in the global north like yourselves can learn from us, but as well as learn from you. And you can find me on Twitter as well at Nanddudu. And thank you so much, Doug, for having us.
All right, guys, this has been a real treat learning, and it was just kind of fun. I got flashbacks of my time at CBA, and hopefully I can go do a future one. So we're going to include all your information, Twitter, all that. There's a web page for each of these episodes, so we'll include that so people have access to that. But again, this has been kind of an amazing episode in the sense that we're all over the world, and we kind of came together and we worked with time zones. So appreciate everyone had kind of different time zones. And thank you so much. I want to take you into just chatting before I let you go, so I just want you to hold on. But thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.